America was founded as a constitutional republic. By calling America a democracy until people thoughtlessly accept and use the term, the totalitarians have obscured the real meaning. The writers of the Constitution were anxious to safeguard liberty, but their chief anxiety was to protect the country against democracy. The system was designed to prevent both tyranny by government and reckless rebellion by the people. We must restore it and keep it. And what can you do toward that end?
Welcome to Congressional Radar, the channel dedicated to congressional news, policy, and history. I'm your host, E. Today we're talking about how Congress works. So first, let's start talking about the structure of Congress. In the United States, there are three main branches of government. The executive, which is where the president sits, the judicial, which is where the Supreme Court is, and then there's the legislative, that's where Congress sits. Within Congress, there's two chambers. There's the House of Representatives and the Senate. Think of this as the JV and varsity teams. Just like in high school, varsity is a bit older. Senators also tend to be pretty old. But a good way to look at the difference is that the House of Representatives are directly representing the people of their state districts, congressional districts, while Senate focuses on the nation as a whole. These are not concrete rules. Both chambers can focus on the issues of the entire nation and their state. Being in the legislative branch, Congress's job is to make new laws that impact society. But this structure was created by the Founding Fathers to represent a body of government meant to be led by the people. Since the legislative branch allows citizens to vote to select members of the Congress, it is the literal branch of government for the people. While we also vote for the president, in the executive branch, the majority of the branch is comprised of choices made by the president themselves and not the people. We don't get to pick who the foreign affairs person will be or who the press secretary will be. Plus, people only metaphorically choose the president because electoral votes, but Congress, having chambers that represent the people, would be voted in by only the people, while the president was responsible for all people in the entire nation. There would be no way that a president can handle each individual cry from every state and understand the issues that matter to those people. Simultaneously, the Supreme Court was meant to uphold the laws of this nation. What seemed like a great structure, and likely still is, eventually did discover new issues, the largest of which is the distribution of representatives per citizen. Over time, as population grew, the number of representatives simply couldn't keep up at the same ratio that it once was. You see, founding Daddy George thought that there should be no more than 30,000 people per representative, and that each state would have at least one representative. But over time, this was unrealistic, because even by the 1790s, there was 57,000 plus citizens for every one representative. By the 1950s, this number had grew tremendously, where there was 345,000 citizens per representative. As of today, near 2024, there is approximately 800,000 citizens per representative, essentially making it impossible for everyone to be truly represented. While the House of Representatives did actually grow at one point, the idea that the House of Representatives should continuously grow with the number of citizens this country has would simply be unsustainable. If the number of citizens per representative stayed at 30,000, there would have to be over 10,000 representatives today. And that's just talking about the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, today we already have over 500 members across the House of Representatives and the Senate, and we all often are very upset with the progress that happens in Congress. So imagine if there was over 10,000 representatives, how much slower progress would be. Can you even imagine a more inefficient Congress than we already have? While growing the number of Congress, or the size of the government in general, is often a bad idea, the real solution is for us as citizens to be more educated about our representative government and to be involved not just in the legislation of which bills are being passed and introduced, but keeping track of these representatives and these senators who are supposed to be working for us. And that's what this channel is dedicated to. Keeping track of every single legislation is nearly impossible because on a weekly basis there can be dozens, if not hundreds, of new bills introduced, especially when an election year has finished and the House of Representatives is refreshed. But the volume of legislation depends on different factors, the biggest of those factors being the size of the chambers in Congress. As of today, there's 435 members in the House of Representatives and an additional 100 senators in the Senate. So you can imagine, with over 500 people running around trying to make laws, it's a bit much to keep up with. And so it's pretty hard for any average citizen, even the news networks, to keep up with this. However, logically, no one needs to keep track of every single issue in Congress. That's why committees and subcommittees exist. There are many dedicated teams to different topics in this country in our Congress. So if you're specifically interested in certain topics like agriculture or armed services, or what each chamber is doing about our budget, or maybe our foreign affairs, our homeland security, our veteran affairs, or small business and entrepreneurship policies, there is likely a specific committee in Congress that relates to you and the policies that you care about. You can find the links to the entire committee list if you just go on congress.gov/committees. So as of recording, there are 35 standing committees across the House and the Senate. These are essentially committees that are always going to happen on topics that will always matter to this country. But special select or other committees can also form for topics that might just be relevant in our time. For instance, today, in the Senate, there is a specific caucus on international narcotics control, on the war on drugs, as I'm sure you've heard, or how in the House, there's a specific committee that talks about China and the Communist Party, and how we as Americans are constantly in competition with them strategically. There's also certain joint committees for certain issues that both the House and the Senate want to be involved in. Currently, there's only 4 joint committees that are standing, but different committees do form every so often. For example, when Donald Trump almost got assassinated in Pennsylvania, Congress came together from both the House of Representatives and the Senate to denounce violence in a joint committee to investigate that assassination, which is still ongoing, by the way. Let us know if you want updates about that. So when it comes to committees and subcommittees, there is a specific process of how committees are chosen. Ultimately, individuals in each committee vary in many ways between things like their tenure, their experience, their knowledge, or the total number of participants in the committee may differ. But theoretically, representatives and senators in each committee are chosen based on alignment with the topic of the committee. So for instance, if you were a businessman and before you came into politics, you were successful at that, your experience might be very valuable for the Committee on Small Business Policy. Similarly, if you are a career military official, now turned congressperson, you'll likely sit on the Armed Services Committee, ultimately for us to utilize that experience in topics that matter to the country, and so on and so forth, in theory. For each chamber of Congress, the members of these committees are chosen by the leadership of the party. Each political party makes its own decisions about which members to appoint for committees. So the GOP Republican leadership will pick which representatives from the Republican side may sit on any committee, and Democrat leadership will pick their representatives for a committee. But there is meant to be a balance in each committee so that all political parties and all political voices can be heard, as they represent voters ultimately. However, the process changes slightly depending on which party has majority. So the party with majority seats in Congress gets additional benefits, you can call it, like dictating the legislative calendar or chairing most committees. So if Republicans have more seats in the House of Representatives like they do today, the chair of most committees in the House of Representatives will also be a senior Republican Party member. The same would happen if Democrats had a majority, but today Democrats have a minority. So ultimately, the legislative schedule is dictated by a Republican. While different political parties always have a voice, the minority party usually has to negotiate more for their legislation to be prioritized. This also has a symbolic meaning to the representation of balance within our Congress, for the people and for the balance of politics themselves. You see, if more people voted in more Republicans, the Republican Party is the favorite party of this country, and thus they should have more representation in Congress. Meaning when they have more seats, they get to control the legislative schedule. But this doesn't mean that Democrats and other political parties don't have any input. It simply means that in the Congress, majority really does rule. While we live in a constitutional republic, this is a very democratic value that was integrated into Congress to make sure that the representatives of the majority of the people in each chamber for each political party were represented. Now that we know the structure and the committees of Congress, let's talk about the powers they have, because Congress's role is extremely powerful. Their power is to make laws, control budgets, provide oversight of other government branches, and most of all, they control how our country may act in times of war. The Constitution says, "To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution and foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof," which is a lot of mumbo-jumbo old speak to say in order for Congress and other powers to continue their power of running this country. Congress has the right to make the laws. There are many excerpts from the Constitution which give Congress their power, but throughout history, these powers have been used greatly. Hundreds of legislations happen per year. In 2014, apparently 296 bills were signed. In 2020, this number increased to 344. While the number of legislation will change every single year, depending on the needs of the people, what it really shows is an excessive power that the Congress has. It's one thing to have the ability to change society, but it's another thing when the population in which that society is changing rarely hears about these updates, and even worse, less than half of them even participate in these votes. There's tons of legislation that you might not agree with, that I might not agree with. And when those moments happen, we ought to know which representatives voted for or against, so that we can make an educated decision when it's time for elections. Another huge consequence of the power of Congress is its relationship to the economy. You see, 100 years ago, when we were on the golden standard, it was everyone's intention to stay profitable, to minimize debt, because we knew what being through a Great Depression meant. We knew what it was when there was no demand and no supply. But today, we don't live on the gold standard. Our economy is mostly imaginary. However, inflation still affects people every day. During the Biden presidency, inflation was sky high, ruining the lives of many people, making it hard to survive. But Congress also plays a role on this, because they approve budgets. They're the reason, in large part, why the government spends so much money. And if there's anyone who can teach us about fiscal irresponsibility, it is our government. Congress is a direct culprit in the equation for increasing inflation, as they often approve budgets for other government agencies, give out money to other countries, and support wars all over the world, even if we're not involved in them. Somehow, often people think that the government doesn't do anything, or that everything is always the same. Well, that literally couldn't be further from the truth. Congress is arguably the most active and most important part of our government. So consider actually voting for your next House of Representative or Senate member in your district. If you're wondering where to find information about your district, just go to Ballotopedia. That's one of the better resources today. With the great power that the Congress holds comes greater responsibility that needs to be upheld, and any one of these Congress people with power must be checked accordingly. So let's do a speed round of the several roles that have great power across or within Congress. First, the leader of each congressional chamber, the House of Representatives leader, otherwise called the Speaker of the House, and the Senate Majority Leader, which is like the captain of the Senate. But what powers do they have? Well, for one, the Speaker of the House is the third person in line to the presidency. So that's kind of important if an active president died and an active vice president also died. If Joe and Kamala both hypothetically became unalive, the interim president would be Speaker Johnson today. I think most people are unhappy with that. So Speaker of the House is important because if Donald Trump and Mike Pence were assassinated in their first term, this person would be president. Aside from the Speaker of the House being third in line to the presidency, they both have pretty typical powers of a leader. They choose agendas, they choose chairmen, they choose members of committees, they're in charge of each body of Congress that they represent, and they're both voted in by other members of the chambers. Nothing too crazy. But let's move on to an arguably more important person in Congress who actually isn't in Congress at all, the Vice President. The Vice President is not an active member of Congress in any capacity, but does have certain powers of control. It's often a ceremonial role that is titled as the President of the Senate. So for instance, if a vote is evenly split in the Senate, the VP has a power to make the tie-breaking vote. So imagine how polarizing it could be when a vice president chooses a direction of law for the entire nation, which both political parties in the Senate could not solve. It's essentially guaranteeing that the decision of the vice president in that moment will upset half of the country. So hypothetically, in the future, if robots want rights and the Senate is about to make a decision, I hope they can solve it. Because if a vice president has to step in and use their tie-breaking rule, even if it isn't because of a robot uprising, it basically guarantees that half of the nation is going to be upset because half of the Senate, which represents the political party of the people, quote unquote, did not get their way. And this is not exactly a compromise, because the decision is completely given to the vice president in those situations. It's actually a little bit ironic because the system, which was crafted to be for the people so eloquently with representation and balance and all these different mechanisms, ultimately comes down to the decision of one person, the vice president, if the Senate can't make a decision. Perhaps Daddy George was a bit of a passive-aggressive guy, don't you think? After all, he was a bit psycho, having crossed a frozen river the night before Christmas to, get a bunch of guys in red coats. Wink wink, I guess this shouldn't be a surprise. Oh wait, that's not about Congress. So the VP's tie-breaking rule is pretty significant, and in fact, across the last 5 presidents, that tie-breaking rule has been used 58 times, so it happens quite often. This points out that even our government has mechanisms for how to move forward when people can't get along. Because if you thought this country being divided is something new, realize that even division within our own government has existed for a long time, and we're still standing. Call it the beauty of the United States, if you will, or call it the foresight of great men that came before us that invented this entire structure for our sake. The VP is far more important than most people know and has incredible power in Congress, which is often utilized throughout history. The last example of the VP's ability and powers over the Congress is their ability to count and certify the electoral votes. You see, when presidents are chosen, our votes, as mentioned previously, are just metaphoric. Symbolic. The people who are deciding the president are ultimately people within the Congress, otherwise known as electoral votes. So when those proceedings are concluded in this country, our Congress gathers to count and certify the vote. This whole process is supervised by the vice president. Some of you might know a recent time where a vice president certifying a vote was under hot contention. Congress, even though it's only one part of the government, plays a significant role in oversight and accountability, as they have powers to block the president and supervise federal agencies. In contrast, the Supreme Court in the judicial branch has powers above the Congress. And once again, comparatively, the executive branch has powers that can be exercised against the other branches of government. This is checks and balances. Let's go through a few examples, just so you understand how checks and balances work with Congress and other branches of the government. If a bill is passed in the Congress, the president receives it for signing. But if the president doesn't like it, he does not sign off on that bill, Congress can actually block the president's veto and codify that new law anyway. All members of Congress from the House of Representatives and the Senate need a 2/3 majority to override the president. So even the president is beholden to Congress, no matter what executive actions they make. On that note, if a president passes a legislation or a budget proposal, Congress does have the right to block that presidential action in the Senate by simple majority. So presidents can't just do whatever they want, and neither can Congress. If Congress passes a bill and it becomes law, they also are beholden to the Supreme Court, and if a court case was later deemed unlawful or unconstitutional because of a law carried out by the Congress, then that law is invalidated because of that case. That law must now be amended. So while Congress is powerful in its own right and has many powers, each branch of government is meant to check and review the other, ensuring each branch has a represented balance of power. Appreciate you watching this video up to this point. If you haven't liked the video, please consider doing so. And if you really like the content, please subscribe. Thank you so much. How does a bill become a law? What does Congress do? Well, here's the ABCs in simple terms. Number 1 is that a bill of legislation is made. Hearings, studies, and revisions are usually made about that bill before it's presented Majority leaders then of Congress in each respective chamber decide what the legislative schedule should be when to vote on certain bills. So the Senate may vote on different bills than what the House of Representatives are voting on, but simultaneously, all bills must pass through both chambers of government to be approved and eventually get to the president. Each chamber of Congress then votes on the proposed bill, and if the bill is passed, then the bill will be presented to the president. If the president approves the bill, it will become law. In reality, the process is not that smooth and not that simple, because there's always contention for different bills. Different representatives have different priorities, and there's often a lot of politicizing about what should be voted on next and what should not be. On top of that, politics is very much like a sorority. Support and reputation is important. As such, many bills never see the light of day because Congresspeople across the aisle don't get support from other representatives. It could be due to many things, like being unpopular or simply just having bad ideas. Either way, bills have to pass through highly divided political lines. Bills that might start off as Democrat might never see support because Republicans don't want to work with them. But if an issue is important enough for both sides, then you'll see an expedited process. However, for all bills, there's often fierce debates because all members of Congress across both chambers and all political parties need to express their support or disapproval. Even if some of it is just grandstanding, it's important for these representatives to talk about these issues. After debates, things ultimately come down to a vote. So even in Congress, there is a democratic process. If you want to know what your representative is doing, what bills they sponsor, and what policies they're trying to put through, check out congress.gov. You can find out every single person in Congress and what they vote on, what they support, what they've introduced. You'll find your state and your district, and you can start understanding what these people in government are doing for you or against you, so that you can actually vote. For example, if I lived in Arizona, I'd be super proud to know that one of my House of Representatives is fighting to make sure that our elections are verifiable, legal, and fair, because some people on a specific side of the aisle in Congress want illegal immigrants to vote on their behalf, and that's not okay. Moving on is the most important part of this video, and that's election. In both chambers, things work a little differently. You see, in the House of Representatives, every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives can be swapped. They could all lose re-election, and you will see 435 new faces, or potentially new faces, as most politicians are just politicians from somewhere else. But the Senate, this is a little different. Senators have 6-year terms, not 2 years like the House of Representatives. And because there's only 100 senators, it wouldn't really be possible for all senators to be up for re-election at the same time. So Senate runs a staggered schedule. In the staggered schedule, about a third of the Senate is up for re-election at any given year, and elections happen every 2 years. So between 33 and 34 different senators are being re-elected every 2 years. This means that the election schedules in the House of Representatives and Senate is identical. Every 2 years, you can make a decision in this constitutional republic to vote for your U.S. representative and your Senate that you like and you approve. Ultimately, the people in Congress are voted in by us. They are meant to represent us, but few of us citizens even exercise this power. There's no doubt that politics can be confusing, mystifying, and basically just annoying because of how inefficient they are. But if we want to ever improve that, we need better people in Congress. Simply put, it is a little ironic that every 4 years, thinking we're changing society, when every 2 years, we can change almost the entire makeup of our Congress. So participating in Congress is a much easier way to actually make a change in our society. If you want to find out more about elections in your district, check out Ballotopedia. We're not sponsored or anything, it's just genuinely a good resource. It's been 248 years since the creation of this great nation, and I hope that we have many more cycles of 248 years. If you agree, please give this video a thumbs up so it can reach more people, and if you want to see more videos about congressional news, information, policy, and history, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for your time. See you on the next one. Peace.
Your job, you who care and understand, is to help educate others. And only by this means can we restore our republic.